Welcome to devMode, a podcast dedicated to the tools, techniques, and technologies of modern web development. This is episode number 25, where we wrestle with the hard questions about ethics in our web technology. I'm Michael Rogg from Top Shelf Craft, joined as always by the illustrious Andrew Welch.
Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107.
Yeah, Earl Johnston from Hypatia Industries.
And I'm Marion Milivant.
Marion has gone so far as to sacrifice her dinner reservation to be with us on the podcast today. So thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Marion.
Dinner reservation in Italy.
Yeah.
That's right. And very, very ethically, too. I walked over there and said, hello, I'm here, but I'm canceling.
That does raise mistakes when we clarify that the dinner reservation is a dinner reservation in Italy. So where in Italy are you?
I'm in Piacenza. And the reaction that I get when I say to people, Piacenza is identical to the reaction that we got when we were talking to some other people about Vacaville. So Piacenza is like the Vacaville of Italy. Vacaville is a small city in California, otherwise undistinguished. It's lovely. It's not teeming with tourists. It's very Italian, and I love it.
Cool.
Well, very good. Very good. So we got together today because some stuff went down in the community that we all took notice of that sort of, got us talking to each other about questions about ethics and morals and codes of conduct and things like that. And so we figured that we would just have a chat and kind of try to unpack questions like, to what extent are we morally responsible for the intrinsic ethics of the things that we build, and how much is it our prerogative to ensure that what we build is used according to our morals, and how even do we define and talk about morals and ethics in the context of web technology? What does that even mean? And the thing that got us started talking about this topic was a pull request that went down on the Lerna. It was Lerna, right?
Correct.
Was the project that got this all started, and Lerna is kind of a JavaScript package bundling tool that sort of provides a framework for if you want to build a big project out of but you want to keep component packages separate, then Lerna sort of provides a framework for managing JavaScript projects with multiple package repos and stuff like that. So it may be a tool that you've heard of, maybe not, but it is used by a bunch of big projects, some of which some of the projects that it is used by are like some Palantir-esque things that were in use by agencies like the Immigrations and Customs Enforcement Agency, and around about the time ICE was making news for various scandals and crises on the border, the package maintainers of Lerna, some of them kind of said, we don't really agree with how ICE is handling themselves, and we disagree with, we take moral issue with some of the stuff that's going down, and therefore our way of being active in this conversation is to pull the availability of our technology, our open source technology, from any project that is used by these agencies that we have moral disagreements with. And so there was a pull request where basically the license of Lerna was adjusted to be sort of MIT-ish, except that it explicitly forbade certain entities and their derivative entities from ever using software that includes Lerna as a component.
And we're talking about a number of big companies that were on that list.
Big companies.
Microsoft, Amazon, Ernst & Young, Motorola, Johns Hopkins University, Dell Inc., Xerox, Canon, Vermont State College, LinkedIn Corporation, United Parcel Service, et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
Basically anyone with any sort of connection or collaboration whatsoever with U.S. Immigration and Customs.
Right.
And this is not a podcast about U.S. Immigration and Customs. That just happened to be the blip on the news cycle that precipitated this sort of moral outrage that then manifested as this pull request to basically ban all of these organizations and corporations from using anything that has Lerna inside of it. And so this, of course, it caused an immediate sort of uproar of opinions of various people, both within and without the project, sort of debating both the merit and also the legality of this move to sort of relicense this piece of open source tech so as to specifically ban certain users. And of course, not surprisingly, this PR was almost immediately reverted, and there was a little bit of shakeup on the maintainer roster of this project. So it's an interesting case study that sort of launches this discussion. So with that context sort of as the groundwork, like that's why we started talking about this stuff. What are y'all's thoughts, just gut reaction to this specific case? Is this something that the maintainers had a prerogative to do? Was it a good thing to do? Is it a useful thing to do? How do y'all feel about this case?
Who wants to go first?
I defer to you, Earl.
I love it. I think it's great. When I was reading through the comments on the pull request, most of the arguments against it were basically keep politics out of code, which to me is it. Well, I don't even think to me. I think objectively, it's impossible. Politics is most people. I think when they think of politics, they think of electoral politics and the dog and pony show. I know Andrew's a fan of Zappa. What did he call politics? The entertainment wing of the military-industrial complex, right?
That's true. That's actually very true.
Right. But
God, I love Zappa.
Yeah. No, it's a great and that's a great quote. And I don't necessarily disagree with the pomp and spectacle of electoral politics is not what politics is. Politics is a way that society deals with itself. It's civics. And so politics is the foundation of code because it can't exist without a society. Code came from society. So the idea of saying that you can choose it's an abstraction of politics is what I'm saying. So you can choose to ignore the abstraction, but it's always there regardless of whether you want to pay attention to it or not. So the idea of getting politics out of code is impossible.
I think if you define politics that way, then that is a reasonable thing to say. I think the average person, if they hear politics, they think of the dog and pony show.
Yeah, which is fair, but that doesn't make them right.
I didn't say.
No, I know. No,
I didn't say
no,
that made them right.
I know. But that's part of the reason that this interested me so much is because it goes to show how far separated from reality the people who are making these comments are, because the fact that they don't even understand what politics is sort of negates their opinion, in my point. I mean, well, it doesn't negate their opinion. They're allowed to have it. They just sound like a dummy.
So here's the funny thing about language, though, Earl, is that things get defined to be whatever people agree that they are, right? So while I agree with you that the strict definition of politics is exactly what you're saying, that is not what people think that it is, and therefore it will be redefined to mean what people think it is. I mean, that is how language works, and that's, as you know, I'm a huge proponent of free speech, and that's something that I'm on the same page with Zappa about. But we have to understand that language changes, and language is produced by people, and it changes over time. There are certain words that meant perfectly valid things back in the day that now mean something completely different, right? So we can't get too smug about, they don't even know what the word means, because the word means whatever everyone thinks it means. That's what language really is. But I have a question for you, though. So you said you love it. Are you saying that you love the initial change that he made, or are you saying that you love the insta-restore to MIT license apology and demotion of this guy from being a maintainer?
No, I like the political act.
The fact that it brought up that we're all talking about it is another.
Oh yeah, I think it's very useful that it spawns the discussion. I just wanted Earl to clarify, which part of it did you really like?
Well, Rog was asking, I think, specifically about the actual pull request,
oh, okay.
Not the restore.
Okay.
I'm talking about the pull request. I think that any person basically taking a political stance especially when business is involved, as that's for some reason commonly looked at as like supposedly to be politically neutral, which is okay. I'm always happy to see people take a stance for what they what they believe in. And just to speak to, your comments about language as like an evolutionary or emergent like phenomenon, basically you're talking about things that change by, society's standards. I think that's true. And I'm sure that we'll get into this at some point. I think that's true for morality and ethics as well.
Of course.
Since there's no objective morality with nobody to hand something down on high.
Of course. Yeah, I'm just saying that, we can't...
Well, that's a position that there's no objective morality, but not everybody will agree with you for sure.
Right. Lots of people will say that there is a objective morality, and I don't want to get into all that nonsense.
No.
all that I'm saying is that, we can't get too smug about, these people don't even know what politics means, because politics means what everyone thinks it means. And if it reaches the point where everyone thinks it means the dog and pony show, and I think we've reached that point, then that's what it means. Right. So we can't pedantically look at the definition that's in the dictionary and say, this is what it is.
They're talking about is the question of, by politics, in this case, they were talking about this question of ICE and is it reasonable or not to try and influence whether this software is used for those ends.
Well, I think an interesting question here, too, is I understand what you're saying, Earl, in terms of everyone has their, if an individual wants to protest, let them. And I totally agree with that from a freedom of speech point of view. But did this person actually have the legal right to do that, is the question.
As far as I understand, there's allowed to be sub-licenses within the MIT license. So, obviously I'm not...
but does he own the entire code base so he can make this sweeping change and say, I don't care about everyone else that contributed. This is what I care about. Therefore, I'm changing this.
I'm not totally sure. Maybe if anybody else has any.
Pull request is a request, right? That's the process.
Yeah. I know that the person that started the project commented on that pull request and said that they were fine with, basically that they wouldn't have done it themselves, but they were fine with it.
But the person who actually merged it in, my understanding, is the guy that wrote it, and he had the authorization to then merge it in. So that's where it came from. This one guy, believe his name is James Kyle, decided that he wanted to make this change, and so he did it.
The question is not making the pull request, but merging the pull request.
Yeah. He said, this is what I care about. Boom. I'm pulling it in there. And then the question is, well, look, this is a project that's a joint collaboration between a whole bunch of people. Does he have the actual right to do that? Let's say that you have worked in a group on some kind of big project, and then someone has a view that is so antithetical to everything that you stand for, and they decide to change their licensing terms to reflect that. Wouldn't you be kind of mad?
Well, yeah, of course. And then obviously this got reverted. And I'm not sure does anybody know what the decision-making process was that they went through? Was it like a democratic process amongst the contributors and the moderators, or did they just like knee-jerk revert it because, controversy?
I don't know the behind-the-scenes stuff. I would imagine that they talked about it, and it wasn't just reverted, by the way. There were numerous apologies that were issued regarding this, and James Kyle was removed from the GitHub organization and no longer has even the privilege of making any kind of direct contributions to the code. Right. So he was kind of excommunicated for this.
Yeah, but that's the consequence of, when you talk about free speech and stuff, I think a lot of people get that confused with you being able to say whatever you want, consequence free.
Right.
All free speech is allowing you to, and I'm not explaining, likely all of you, know this, but this is a conversation that comes up a lot with, usually it's like some kind of straw man or something where people talk about more rights and more free speech. What they're talking about is they seem to think that you're allowed to say whatever you want without any consequences, when in fact free speech protects you from persecution from the state.
Yes.
You can't be arrested for saying something.
Right.
But it doesn't mean consequence free. So what this person did, this is a perfect example of that. The person exercised their free speech and within the constructs of GitHub, performed they went on their own and they did something, and there was consequences for that, and they got kicked out of the project. Whether or not you think that was right or not is a different.
And that's the big problem that I have with this whole thing is like I'm just going to abstract away this guy's views because I don't think it matters. Like I don't really care what his views are or are not. The real problem I have with this whole thing is that the unilateral nature of it, where he just decided, I care about this. I'm going to do this. Screw all you guys. This is what is happening. And you're right. Free speech is the government abridging your right to free speech. If you work for a company or an organization, they can tell you you can't say certain things. And if you don't like it, too bad. I mean, they'll fire you, And you're right. There is a lot of confusion over that.
Sorry,
I think there was in the end, the explanation for the revert back to the original license was twofold. And the first was it was ultimately determined that this relicensing and the decision to approve, like other maintainers' decisions to approve this change, was a rash decision, and not enough thought had been put into its consequences. But then also there were, I think, the general decision was that the PR, by its very nature, had violated the code of conduct of the project.
Yep.
And so I think ultimately how they landed back in the their original territory under the MIT license was sort of as a response to the project's own code of conduct, as interpreted in the days after this whole brouhaha went down.
Yeah. And the specific parts of that code of conduct that this very likely violated is being respectful of differing viewpoints and experiences, right?
Right.
Focusing what is best for the community, which is arguable, right? I mean, from some point of view, you would say that it is doing exactly that. Showing empathy towards other community members, and then other conduct which could reasonably be considered inappropriate in a professional setting. I mean, and then there may be some other ones that this would fall into, but. So
probably it sounds to me like the process worked, and the right thing to have done would be to have submitted that pull request, which seems like a perfectly reasonable thing to do, and then gone through some careful process of thinking about, do we want to merge this or not?
Right.
Taking into account everything you want to take into account.
Yeah.
And then that would have been fine.
Yeah.
But sort of unilaterally making that move, not so good. And then, he got booted out, which is the reasonable thing what would happen. And it's sort of like projects are of various sizes and have various amounts of, difficulty making doing that sort of thing. Like you couldn't do that to the Linux core. They're
right.
They're much, much, much more checks and balances and care about what goes into there because,
the contributor base is vast.
Well,
the contributor base is vast, and they really don't want people, sneaking in root access and
right. The implications
you try to do.
The implications are really broad if something like that got changed. And I may be incorrect. It may not be that this was him unilaterally merging it. I'm kind of reading that into what I'm seeing here.
He certainly sought and received approval.
Okay.
From other,
but maybe not enough of a review process.
But I would have. Personally, I think I would have liked to see, both specifically in this case and also generally as a principle, anytime you're making a philosophical change to a project, you're making a change that is representative in some way, even retroactively, of everyone contributing to that project. And I think that you sort of owe it to the project to be very, very slow and rigorous and conservative about how and if you're going to make those sorts of changes. And I think, the kernel is a great sort of counterexample to this, because there is so much process and so much rigor and so much hierarchy sort of protecting the kernel, both explicitly by policy and also implicitly by sort of project culture, protecting the kernel from any sort of rash, quick changes, either philosophical or technological. And I tend to feel like that's a good thing. I also, the other reason the kernel is a cool example is because a lot of the seeds of the open source movement and what we know is sort of like the principles and philosophies of open source software come from the kernel and its community and its sort of surrounding projects.
Well, from Stallman, really.
And like so there are principles of open source that are defined, and they include that open source software should not discriminate against any person or group.
Right.
And should not discriminate against any field of endeavor.
Right.
And those are core principles of open source software. And so, it becomes a bit of a balancing act.
Are those good principles?
Right.
We should try to answer that. I tend to think that they are good principles because when you are participating in open source software, by its nature, you have declared this thing that you are building to transcend your own locus of control. Like, it's bigger than me. It's no longer I am building a thing. It's we are building a thing. Even if in practice, I am the only contributor and I'm releasing a thing under MIT just because I'm a nice guy and I want people to be able to do what they want with it. Like, by declaring that something is open source and legally licensing it as such, I have made that thing bigger than me. Mm-hmm. And I have made it bigger than my own preferences and my own convictions. And I have put it out to the world and I've said, we are building this together, and since it's the global we at that point, I think you can't make really any assumptions about the people or the groups or the fields of endeavor that might pick up your software. And that gets to be a real moral qualm or a real dilemma if you have big qualms with how your software gets used. And so which principle is subservient to which?
Yeah, I mean, he's basically saying anyone that doesn't agree with me on this issue, you can't use our stuff. And that's what he's saying, right? He's kind of taking his ball and going home and saying, if you don't agree with me on this particular issue, I don't want to be working on anything that you benefit from leveraging. And I do wonder if there are legal implications in just changing a license like this. I mean, it's that kind of part of it is interesting to me as well, but we probably can't get into that. But I also do think it's somewhat of like, while I totally agree with Earl's perspective in that people should be able to protest whatever they want, whenever they want. Like, I'm totally good with that. But you also have to look at this from the perspective that, I mean, this guy is kind of being narcissistic about it, saying that, you have to agree with me if you want to use this, and I'm not going to let anyone into my little tribalist group of people that use this technology unless you agree with me. And that's just, I don't know. That's just
it's the same.
He was changing the rules.
Yeah.
And that's one thing. But, if I start some open source thing and I have not, the MIT license, but the Nulevant license, which, lays out my ethical whatevers, is that okay? Or is that just never okay to do that?
I don't know that the question is whether it's okay, because if you're building a thing, you can license it however you want,
right?
And it's okay. Mm-hmm. The question is whether it's open source, and if it follows the principles of free redistribution and open source code and allowing derivative works and non-discrimination and things like that, mm-hmm. then it's open source. Well, but if you say, you can only use my software if you hold such and such moral tenets, then it's not open source. And this is why it's like, do we believe more strongly in our own rightness, right, or in the sort of noble principles of open source? I mean, if I brought my ball to the playground to use Andrew's example, and somebody was like using my ball to murder someone, I would feel morally compelled to take my ball away from that person and say,
Right.
first of all, you shouldn't be murdering this person, and
Right.
secondly, you sure as hell aren't going to do it with my ball.
Right. But then they're just going to murder them with their fists.
Yeah, okay, but like then where's the threshold, and where is the, at what point is that a slippery slope to sort of just me being authoritarian about my beliefs in the context of a project that I have released and designated as bigger than myself?
And that's the key thing from my point of view, is that open source is open, right? It's open to everybody. That's the idea. And if it is open to everybody, there are going to be people and organizations in there that you don't agree with, right? I mean, that's just the nature of making something open like that. And then trying to have it both ways, where it's going to be open source, but only to people who agree with us. It sounds incredibly antithetical to the idea of open source and collaboration to begin with. I mean, at least to me.
Well, I mean, you're dealing in absolutes at that point, and that's generally like a foolish thing to do. Which, I mean, so I'm of course down with open source. I mean, I'm a Linux user, but I don't think it doesn't have to be hard all one way or the other.
Would it be right for like Linus one day to be like, you can't use Linux if you're from the U.S. government because I don't like who's in the government right now?
Right. Yeah.
No,
it would change the. I mean, like you said, it would change the. It would no longer be open source.
Right.
Right.
But in the same sense, I mean, Andrew brought up earlier about how freedom of speech protects you from the government. It doesn't protect you at work.
Yep.
And a lot of the time, the like libertarian argument against like, oh, if you don't like something at work, go get another job. Which, okay, fine. Some people can do that. A lot of people can't. Just go and get another job. That's not really how it works. But the same thing is true with this Lerna thing. You don't like the new license, use something else.
Fork the project at whatever point it becomes no longer open source, and
yeah, that's the thing to
use
do. That's the thing to do, is to fork it before they changed it.
Like LibreOffice, right? That because OpenOffice got sucked up in the evil that is Oracle. And so that's why we're all using LibreOffice.
Right.
Oh, right. Yeah. Yeah.
And the same thing with Hudson and Jenkins.
Well, and at a fundamental level, the idea is like, if you have done some unit of work, do you then have the ability or the right to tell who can or cannot use that work? And I would argue it depends on the context in which that work was done. If the work was done in the context of a MIT open source license, no. You can fork it and you can change the license, and that's fine. The work that you do from then on can be under this new license, and then people can pick and choose whether they want to do it. But retroactively making that change, I think, is horrible, because you're essentially, lots of companies and people and individuals have all built a huge scaffolding of technology based on top of this thing that you did, right? And you can't just yank that out from under them. It's just not right,
So,
would there be ever a situation in which it would be right? Like, just as a thought experiment, like, how convicted would you have to be, and how bad would the thing on the other end have to be before it might be right?
Yeah, because I would argue that if there is ever a case, then it's fine. It's fine anytime. Like if you're willing to say that, like, yeah, if they were, I don't know, if they were literal Nazis or something using this, and I would be okay with them changing the MIT license to keep Nazis from using it.
I mean, if anybody has been watching the news,
right.
I think a generally accepted opinion at this point is that every single person in ICE is a Nazi.
Right. Yes. Right. Exactly.
And I'm
top to
being,
bottom.
for clarity, I am being sarcastic.
Yeah.
Right.
But yeah, I mean, that's a reasonable question, I think.
Well, I kind of disagree with that, Earl. I mean, I think that we can't be black and white on this stuff. I think that there are shades of gray, and there can be things that can be tolerated and things that potentially could be not tolerated. But my threshold for what would not be tolerated would be ridiculously high. Like it would have to be some kind of a unanimous decision from every single, person that contributed to and maybe even organization or person that uses it. I mean, it just, I don't think you can say that just because there is an edge case, that means that it has to be allowable for all cases. Because then I could have a license for something and I contribute to it and I do all this stuff and I'm like, you know what? I don't like Earl. Mm-hmm. Earl, everybody else can use this, but Earl, you can't use that. Mm-hmm. And then, I mean,
somebody's
come on.
done that with a new pigment.
Are you kidding? What is it?
No, I forget what it's this super, super black pigment and it's licensed to the license says this particular artist isn't allowed to use it.
Wow. I think I remember reading about that.
That's funny.
That's hilarious, though.
That is funny, and that is the prerogative of whoever created this thing and is licensing it.
Right.
And if they want to take out their beef, then great. You could take out your beef on whoever you want in whatever legal way you want, but
if it's just you,
but that's if it's just you,
right?
And how much do we believe in sort of the noble purpose and principles of open source? I think I wonder, in sort of watching these sorts of stories unfold, and this tendency is much bigger than just the bubble of web technology. But I think that there's this sort of part of the fear that that motivates how much emotion goes into these decisions is sort of the feeling that if something I built is used for a purpose that I vehemently oppose,
right,
that I might feel somehow complicit or culpable. How do y'all feel about that idea? Like, how responsible are we for guiding and or deciding how other people use the stuff we build?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of like Oppenheimer, right?
That's literally who I was thinking of,
Yeah, because he obviously he worked, it was a key person that was involved in the development of the atomic bomb, and then later on came to, regret that happened. But, you can't stuff that genie back into the bottle. And I think a lot of it is kind of the same way with software to some extent or another. But what do you mean specifically, Michael? Like, would I care if someone used something I open sourced in some kind of a project that I just completely disagree with? Is that what you mean?
Yeah, and I mean, I would even go further, because in this specific case, there's a lot of debate about the moral goodness or badness of the people using the Lerna project or whatever, but like not just something you disagreed with, but something that you felt convicted about, like that it was causing great harm.
Like if some of my code ended up running Skynet, like that type of thing.
Like if some of your code ended up running Skynet, or if, like, I don't know, like some terrorist group was using SEOmatic to make their recruiting more effective, so that they could go murder people. Like, I mean, this is obviously a extreme example, but whatever it is, like,
I don't think it's
you
that
find
extreme.
your code, you find your code being used for purposes that you feel are not only nefarious, but like gravely immoral.
It would have to be, the barrier would have to be like super duper high for me, because, I mean, let's say it was used by some terrorist organization or something like that. I mean, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, depending on your perspective. So it would have to be something incredibly black and white that I almost find it difficult to come up with a scenario like that. And it's also the kind of thing, like, when you create something, are you then responsible for how people then use it? Like
Right.
Stanley.
That is what I'm asking.
Stanley, when they make a hammer, are they responsible and should they feel morally conflicted when someone takes that hammer and bashes someone's head in with it? And I think that
if you're working for the hammer designers and they are asking you design hammers that will be particularly good for bashing in heads,
right?
Then
That's true.
that is a place where you might want to say, okay, I'm not willing to do that. Or if you're
Agree.
marketing hammers and they think that this is a reasonable way to market hammers,
Great for head
then
bashing.
you might want to say no.
Right.
Yeah, I think you're right. It depends on the intent of the thing, right? Because just to keep that analogy, because it's very simple, pretty much anything can be a weapon. But at what point are you designing something that is designed to be good at doing that, right? So I agree with you from that point of view. Like, that's how I would probably think of it. Am I writing something general purpose that, yes, it can be used for good, yes, it can be used for bad? Then it wouldn't really bother me. If it was something that was very specifically enabling people to do what I considered to be horrible things, then I wouldn't feel very happy about it.
And
What if it was
Go ahead, Mary.
just something like you didn't feel great about? Somebody was using SEO-matic to, market cigarettes to teenagers. And they come to you and they say, hey, I'm having this problem. Can you help me with it?
If they bought a license, then I would support it.
Okay.
Obviously, I don't agree with the fact that they're using it to do that, but I view my responsibility as a craftsman is that I made this thing. A client is having an issue that they, have a problem with it, and I'm answering their support issue. Now, and there are certain kinds of jobs, though, that I have turned down because I don't want to do them. And they're not even on moral grounds. I guess they're on moral grounds. But, like, if a marketing company wants me to help them implement something that I think will make the website terrible, I will just say, nah, find someone else. You know what I mean? But that gets back to your case where I am doing it specifically for that purpose. You know what I mean? Like, I know that I'm designing it specifically for that. Whereas if I'm designing something that is very general and could be used for any number of purposes, like, there's no way that I could keep track of every possible purpose.
So for the sake of the thought experiment, and I don't want to push this too far, but because your view seems to be relatively strong towards the belief that the things that I build do not have intrinsic ethics, and I can hope that they'll be used well, but I'm not responsible if they're not used well, and also I have a responsibility to if I agree to support a thing, or if I agree to do anything, my responsibility is to keep that agreement as though the thing on the end is ethically neutral. Here, let's push the thought experiment one step further. So you're about to release a piece of software.
All right.
And let's just say, since this is the circle that we run in, it's a craft plugin. Well, a craft plugin can only be licensed with MIT or with the craft license.
Right.
There is no option for a proprietary license if you want that thing to be, distributed on the platform, on the plugin store, and whatever else. So
that means I can't exclude Earl.
and the craft license itself is fairly closely derivative of the MIT license, and it includes a provision that what you're doing has to be lawful, but doesn't really ascribe any moral goodness or badness in terms of restricting the things under these licenses. So you're about to release a craft plugin, and the only options that you have for releasing it are open sourcey. And I, the hypothetical villain, come to you and I say, I can't wait for you to release this thing. As soon as you release it, I am going to use it to do an evil thing. And you take me at my word that this evil thing that I intend to do will be sufficiently evil that you will be really morally disappointed about it.
Right. Then what?
So
let me backpedal on something a little bit because
you release the thing, knowing what I want to do with it. Are you responsible? How responsible are you?
All right. So let me backpedal on something a little bit, actually. So as many people know, I ran a software company for a very long time. And one of the things that I always gave the people who did support for me the power to do was to fire customers, right? So if a customer was being abusive towards them or whatever, I left it up to their discretion that they could fire a customer. I think that in thinking about it, if Philip Morris or some company came to me and they were going to use SEO-matic specifically to do SEO that would target the youth, I would probably fire them as a customer because the money means less to me than that, kind of thing that I don't like that they're doing, right? But to get to your question about, I can't wait until you release this. I'm going to use this for some horribly evil thing. It's difficult. Like I would have to really understand the scale of that evil thing. And then I would also think about all of the really good things that people would potentially be using it for, right? Do we live life in fear of the bad things that people are going to be using our code for? Or do we also think about the good?
So is it more of a hammer or more of an assault rifle?
Correct.
Yeah. That's a good answer to that. And it specifically avoids falling into, the trap that is laid by this thought experiment.
Right.
And
what was the trap?
well, to have to define how morally responsible you think you are,
right, for
bad things that someone is going to do with the product of your craft. And I think the wisdom in your answer is in refusing to oversimplify your response to ignore all of the contexts other than the one that I'm asking you about.
Right.
And I think that decisions to either extreme, I think, frequently fall prey to exactly that fallacy, which is, to answer a moral question based on one specific instance of it without considering the larger context. And so I think there's a lot of wisdom in that answer, which is, just to say, well, if I zoom out a few steps, does this still seem as egregiously bad?
Well, I just want to point out, too, that not releasing that software is not the only thing that you could choose to do. Like, as the creator of something or someone who wields a certain amount of power in a community, you're allowed to use that platform to talk about what you think is right and about who is using your stuff incorrectly, which is sort of what that person the maintainer from Lerna did. They did what was within their power, which was to use their platform to say, I'm not cool with putting kids in cages, so I'm going to do this.
But it was one guy, though.
Still, it doesn't matter. That's my point.
Okay.
His power was that thing that he did. He can't go down and physically rescue kids from cages the temporary jails that ICE was putting these kids in. All that person could do was the thing that they did, and they did it. So to say that and I don't think this is the argument that you're making, but you are morally responsible to do what you think is right within the context of the power that you have. And whether that's deciding not to release that software or deciding to release it, but then making a public statement against, hey, this person's going to use my software to do this terrible thing, whatever. You can't just skirt your responsibility 100% of the time, because you are responsible in some way. Mm-hmm. But you're also not 100% responsible. It made me think when you're talking about the person who denied the use of the artist, the pigment or something like that. Well, it just got me thinking that how everything that we have is built on everything that came before us. So the idea that once you make something, and this is sort of like the sort of open source thing, once you make something and put it out there, it's not yours. It's not yours anymore. And it's like there's a lot of conflict. I have a lot of conflict about all of these things that we're talking about.
Right.
But I do. I guess that's the part that I love the most about the Lerna thing is that this one person they showed some conviction, and that's so rare, I think, for people to actually do what they think is right. More often than not, people know what they've made a decision about what is right for them, and they so rarely act on it. Which is, whether that's like you standing behind some jerk berating a barista or something like that for no reason, and wanting to say something and not.
Oh, I would totally say something.
Of course, lots of people would, but lots of people wouldn't. And the fact that and more people need to act on their conviction, I think. And I'm regardless of what turned out with the Lerna thing, I'm glad that person did it.
I respect him for making a stand and standing up for his convictions, but I would also say that that the way he acted was not in the context of just himself, so he acted somewhat unilaterally and somewhat immaturely, I think.
I think the key that you said is everyone is responsible to do what they think is right within the power and ability that they have.
Yep.
And so the line that we draw is, what is the power and ability that I have, and in what places have I abdicated my power and responsibility by virtue of, belonging to some open source collaboration that is bigger than me, and then how do I solve the qualm when those things are in conflict?
Yeah. I mean, I know for a fact that tons and tons of people are using my software that I don't necessarily agree with them on some stuff, right? But I'm not going to go out and ban them from using it, right? It would really depend on how incredibly egregious that I thought that this stuff was, because you got to understand, I mean, you live in a world where lots of people have very, very different opinions on things. And there are lots of things that I just don't agree with, but I'm just like, okay, I mean, it's your right to believe and think that way, Right.
But what you just described is what that person did. The Lerna person said, this is too egregious for me.
Right.
And then they acted on it. And the other thing too is I want to draw there's a difference between disagree about your favorite football teams,
right,
and things like that. When you're talking about, it's not, I don't know what the best way to put it is, but when you're talking about a group of people, I mean, not to say that all ICE agents do terrible things, but the reports that were coming out of some of those camps about the treatment of the kids that were in and I hate to be one of those people that's think of the children, but in this specific example, I don't think that's not the same as disagreeing about sports teams or something,
right? No, I agree. I mean, there obviously are different levels of this, right?
Yeah.
On a lot of these issues, when a particular group is demonized for whatever, I think that Hanlon's razor is probably right. It's or a kind of synopsis of that. In that most
Hanlon's razor.
Well, it's never ascribe to malice what can be better ascribed to incompetence, right? And I don't mean exactly that. I mean more like the average person who is in a particular group or whatever. They're just there. That's their job. Right. And they probably don't have these horrible bad intentions that they might be ascribed,
Yeah, well, I don't think
some do,
I don't think that
all of that just following orders business has a...
Yes. I was thinking that as I was saying it.
Right. It's people not acting on their convictions.
Yeah, that's absolutely true.
I don't think that I don't feel like any of the debate around Lerna's licensing really targeted any individual behavior in any sort of uncivil way. I felt like it was targeting the behavior and capability of the organization acting as an organization, and so at least that much I felt was legit. Mm-hmm. It would have been one thing if you went individually vilifying ICE agents in the PR, but doing it corporately is somewhat necessary if you're trying to make a moral argument about common good.
Well, I also don't put much stock in civility when it comes to certain things like this. I mean, there's time and places for civility. Again, if we're talking about something trivial, that doesn't matter. But if you're talking about being civil to people that like there's a lot, whenever you see any of these politicians get accosted in restaurants and things like that, the first thing people are saying, like, oh, we live in a society that's like just not civil. It's like, man, that dude just voted to take away your health care and the health care of 30 million other people. I can't swear. I don't care if they're comfortable at a restaurant or not. You know what I mean? I want them to be uncomfortable. That's the way that you hold them accountable. There are consequences to the things that you do. So anyway, that civility argument, I understand where it comes because we want to live in a society and like we want things to be, but I also don't care about it.
But now you're focused on the dog and pony show, Earl. You're over on the dog and pony show side.
That's not when you so recent locally there was this this is going to be esoteric because it's a local issue, but there's this person who owns this apartment building that's just riddled with code violations, and they just can't seem to get anything done. So these people went to his house.
Right.
They went to his house. They stood outside of his house. His neighbors came out, whatever, and they got it done. And there's people that would be like, well, that's not really the process. And
I think that's awesome.
That's not really civil or whatever. But
I think that's awesome.
And I don't know I don't necessarily think that that's dog and pony. I think that's direct action.
No. I meant when you were talking about, the politician.
Yeah. But they are the ones that make the decisions. They're the ones that sign on the dotted line when these things. So they are part of the dog and pony show, but they are also the people with their hands on the lever.
Right.
So I'm fine with accosting.
And people would then argue that, I actually agree with you that it's fine to hold people responsible for the things that they do, but some people would say, okay, well, the right way to do that is to then vote them out of office, But I think that people need to let the people that represent them know what they care about and what they don't care about. And I think that by someone doing that, you're doing it. But I want to get back to the Lerna thing real quick. I mean, something I think Michael mentioned, like if you read the initial PR, it's super emotional. Right? It's clearly not a reasoned decision. Yep. It's super emotional. He talks about his emotions in it, right and left in here. And he also talks about my this and my that, right? And I think that's really where I start to have an issue with this is, first of all, I don't think it was a level-headed decision. I think it was an emotional one. And that's usually a problem, right? I mean, whether it's in business or in your personal life, when you do things when you're in a super emotional state, you often end up regretting them, right? And then the other big problem I have with it is that, again, he talks about, my this and my that. Dude, you open source this. You have tons of people that work on it with you and that contributed to it. I don't know. I mean, that's where I start to have a problem with this. And that's why this guy is no longer part of the organization.
Yeah, so I mean, I think so actually I want to kind of chase down this theme of emotional decisions. Because I think emotions are a good precipitator of moral action. Mm-hmm. Like the conscience is for a reason.
Yep.
But I think where this all leads is, if we're going to talk about on an individual scale, we should do what we think is appropriate given the power and platform that we have. Mm-hmm. Fine. No, I think nobody disputes that.
Yeah, for sure.
In the context of things which we build, which we in one way or another release to be outside of our complete control. If they are not going to be governed by my own individual morality, how should they be governed? And how can they be governed in a way that sort of balances all of the different areas of concern? I mean, when you talk about ethical decision making, especially in technology, there's so many different dimensions in which we're trying to balance a definition of what's right and wrong.
Right.
Like you said, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Mm-hmm. And that sounds like an extreme position, but the only thing that differentiates the terrorist from the freedom fighter, believe.
Oh God.
Oh no, we lost Rog.
That's all right.
Oh, he's back.
You know,
Rog, we lost.
issues
Hold on.
Hang on,
Back up, Michael. Back
human
up.
life
Michael.
and,
Michael.
You know, human
Maybe-
health
Maybe he can't hear us.
and
Michael.
issues about
Dear God.
you know, immigration get countered with issues about sovereignty and security. And so there's always, like, as there should be, there's always this tension between different sides of a moral cause. And so once a thing is out there, how should it, like, who should get to decide ultimately how these things get regulated? Like, what's right and wrong? Where do we put that power if it's not individual to me?
So, Michael, I'm not sure if you can hear us or not.
Can you hear us?
And he can't.
He can't hear us. Oh, no.
Awesome.
Now what?
All right. Well, we're going to continue on.
All right.
Go ahead.
All right. So, I mean, I'm going to try, you know, it's a tough question to answer because my first instinct obviously is democratically, you know, but at what point, how do you decide who gets to decide on it? Because in something like this, you know, it would seem obvious on its face that the contributors and the maintainers of Lerna would make the decision about, you know, if they're going to update the license or not. But they're not the only ones that are affected by this. The users are affected. And then the people who, at the other end of it too, like, for example, the people that are affected by ICE operating efficiently are also affected by it. So if we were really to try and get everyone who could potentially be affected by this, I mean, we might be talking about everyone. So I honestly don't know. I don't know what this, like, the decision-making process for something like this is. But I also, too, just want to go back really briefly while we're trying to get Rog back on.
I'm back.
Oh, okay, cool. He can hear us. All right, sweet. But just in terms of, I just have a little beef just tangentially about the idea of emotionless decision-making. It's another thing that I think is objectively impossible. As not just, you know, Michael rightly said that it can be the impetus to lead us to starting to think about making some kind of decision, but also, you know, your reason is informed by every experience that you've had, which includes emotional experience and logical experience. So I just don't think you can really separate.
There's
like,
that.
you know,
And then if something is hurting people, then the people who are the ones who are being hurt are the ones who are going to be most emotional about it, and the
Right.
people who are, you know, well, them's the breaks, sorry, it's affecting you that way, are going to be a little less emotional about it,
Right.
yeah.
most likely.
That's
Yeah.
levels of empathy, basically.
Well,
is what
I
you're talking
didn't.
about.
I did not mean to say that the decision should be made without emotion, because of course, I mean, that's part of what makes us human. What I meant, I should have said in the heat of the moment or under extreme emotional duress, because even the law recognizes this, right? Like, there are certain actions that you can take, and if it's determined that you're under extreme emotional duress, that will be taken into account. You know, in terms of, like, if there's a crime of passion or a heat of the moment type thing. And the reason that's taken into account is that when people are in that kind of altered mental state, their judgment is impaired, right?
Right.
So I'm not saying keep emotion out of your decision-making process. I'm saying that this guy, at least what I'm reading from his initial PR that's in here, he was in a very heightened emotional state when he did this. And I think he probably wasn't thinking clearly. I didn't mean to imply that emotion should be kept out of the decision-making
Right.
process,
Yeah.
because I totally think it should.
Yeah.
But I think he was hysterical is probably too strong of a word, but in a heightened emotional state when he did all of this.
Yeah.
And had he cooled off, he might have still proceeded with something like this, but taken a more kind of rational approach to it, while still factoring in that he was emotionally outraged.
It's possible. It's also possible that this person's just a passionate writer. I mean, people do that too. It doesn't necessarily, just because it reads like, or just because you interpret it as him banging it out at a keyboard at 3 a.m. while he's mad.
Right.
And also, I wasn't necessarily critiquing you specifically about the emotionless thing, but there is a pretty common fetishization, especially in, I think, the tech community, about this, like, cold, rational, objective decision like the Dr. Houses and
that doesn't exist.
It does. Right. And also, but not only does it not exist, but people seem to think that there's some merit to it. And I don't agree with that. I mean, I don't agree that you should be making decisions when your head is hot. But at the same time, I don't think that I don't want people making decisions when they're a sociopath, basically.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
You're right.
That's not
You're
not
right.
good
If you remove all emotion and you remove all moral and ethical considerations from something, you're essentially talking about a sociopath.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Or
if you're having an argument, a disagreement, people are having a disagreement, and if you discount the people who are bringing their emotions to the disagreement,
right,
that's problematic.
Yeah.
But it certainly is true that if you want your pull requests to be taken to have more weight, then from a practical point of view, it's probably better to try and phrase them somewhere, strongly, but not have them come across as overwrought. And I haven't read his, so I don't know how I would take it.
Yeah. But Rog, I feel like I meant that to be tangential, and then we ended up going on much more of a tangent than I meant to. You had asked about the decision-making process.
Yeah, no, I think it's a good tangent. Where it's leading me to is, I think we as technologists, a lot of times the caricature of a developer is basically, a sociopath sitting in a dark room banging out code all day and all night.
Right.
And we know that caricature to be very false. But I think it's a fair criticism of ourselves to say that we are well trained in the technical arts. Mm-hmm. But as an industry, I don't know that we're well trained in the liberal arts. I don't know that a lot of developers have the educational background or even like any sort of rigorous experience that gives us a framework to answer moral questions very effectively. And that's sort of a thing that I'm wrestling with is I feel like I feel like it is incumbent on me to have moral considerations about the technology that I'm building and touching.
Yeah.
Because technology is just getting more and more integral to really, really core aspects of human life. And so I feel like as a creator of technology, it's incumbent upon me to have moral opinions about these things from which to motivate moral actions about these things.
And in some places that's easier than others, right?
Yeah.
Like I'm not well trained in morality. And so decisions that I'm making are basically decisions based on my emotions, my conscience, my life experience, which I'm not going to say are wrong, but I have a very difficult time asserting that they're universally ethically right.
Yeah,
where do I go? Like, how do I, as a technical person, go train myself to have a better, more rigorous, more objective, less emotional framework for answering questions like this?
So there's an old expression that using your morality to guide your behavior is fine. Using your morality to force other people into their behavior is not okay, right? But I actually have a really relevant to this discussion point to bring up. So we were talking about, what if some group is using SEOmatic, right? So I know for a fact that the Dalai Lama uses SEOmatic on his website.
That's amazing.
I know this for a hard and certain fact, right? Would anybody here have a problem with the Dalai Lama using software that they wrote for his promotional website?
No.
Michael?
Do I have a problem with the Dalai Lama running craft? Is that what you're asking?
No. Let's say
a plugin that you wrote.
Yeah, let's say a plugin that you wrote. Let's say the Dalai Lama is using Wordsmith. Like, would you have a problem with that?
It's not unlikely that the Dalai Lama is using Wordsmith.
Okay.
And I don't have a problem with that.
But here's the thing. There are some people on the planet that would have a very big problem with that.
Very big problem.
Very big problem. If you're a Chinese loyalist, you would have a huge problem with that, right? And that's kind of what I was mentioning. I wasn't trying to cop out about it when I said, one man's freedom fighter is another man's hero. But I don't have any problem with the Dalai Lama using SEO-matic. I think it's awesome. I tweeted about it. I'm shameless about self-promoting stuff. And I thought it was awesome. I thought it was really cool. Now, I'm not Buddhist, right?
Right.
I don't necessarily agree with everything the Dalai Lama does or says, but hey, great. He's using my stuff. I think that's really cool.
Right.
But there are definitely people on the planet that would have a huge problem with that. Right? And what if I was one of those people? Would I be reasonable if I wrote into my license, like, the Dalai Lama cannot use this? You know what I mean? And that's kind of the angle that I'm coming at this whole discussion from, that I think that I don't know. I don't think that I don't think it's clear that this guy should be imposing his will in the manner that he did for his, whatever he feels is his personal cause. Earl thinks he has the obligation to, and that's fine too. But everything is relative. I don't have a problem with the Dalai Lama using this stuff. Other people would have a serious problem with it, and maybe Earl would then say, and Earl, you're here, so you can say it. Mm-hmm. Maybe they would then have a moral obligation to then tell the Dalai Lama, hey, you can't use this stuff, right? Is that what you would? Let's say that I was a diehard Chinese nationalist and I wrote SEO-matic and I saw that the Dalai Lama was using it. Would you recommend that I do what this guy did and write into the license, the Dalai Lama cannot use this?
I mean, yeah, it'd be hypocritical of me to say otherwise. I mean, if your convictions point you in that direction, especially with things like these, or things like this, where it's matters of like intellectual property.
Right.
I don't know how much of a material difference to the world it would make whether or not the Dalai Lama uses SEO-matic or not.
Right.
But
maybe you just morally don't like the idea.
Well, right. But I'm saying there is a difference between like philosophical and strictly intellectual things that happen in this, in the realm of philosophy. Whereas if that if that pull request had stuck and it caused ICE issues. Because they became less efficient or they couldn't track people in a certain way or whatever, that would have a material gain for some people.
If I'm a Chinese nationalist and maybe my piece of software could have a material effect on what the Dalai Lama does, and I don't agree with him, then I guess by your logic, I should do that. I mean, my big problem with all this stuff is that I think the great promise of the internet was that, this is great. All the world is going to be able to get together and everyone's going to understand each other and all that kind of stuff. But really what has happened is the opposite. Like people have found ways to seek out people they agree with, right? And people have become, by and large, more and more isolated and very tribalistic in terms of their views. And by saying who can and can't use my software, I feel like I'm becoming like very digital tribalist. I mean, I don't know. I have a problem with that.
Well, I mean, that's, historically we're a tribal species. So I don't know that you're,
Oh man.
Rock.
That's such a deep point though, yeah. Andrew, about like sort of the wide-eyed optimism that the open source movement, was birthed into.
Yep.
Versus the reality of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
Well, because just to interrupt real quickly, it's not one or the other. It is like you said, it's bringing people together that they agree with. But think about just communities that couldn't have existed before without the internet.
That's true.
And they're not the vast majority of them are not like hate groups. Yeah.
Right.
Or us just talking right now. Marion's literally on the other side of the world.
She's on vacation.
Still,
though.
I'm just, but I'm saying, so it is, it's not, and like most of what we're talking about that we've talked about today, it's not one or the other. I think that it's still worth being optimistic about. But that doesn't like exclude you from taking steps when you feel something is wrong, I guess.
And I'm sure I have a line somewhere, right? Like I'm sure there is something that would be bothersome to me. But in general, I have a problem with attempting to impose
marketing cigarettes to teenagers,
right,
or
but,
children was
right. But I have a problem with attempting to impose my views on anyone who's going to use my stuff, right? Because it's a really difficult problem, because you're going to make something and you don't have control over what people are going to be using it for. And there'll be people that disagree with you that are going to use it for something that you disagree with. And I think that in some sense, you have to have the maturity to let that go and allow that to happen. That said, there still is a line where you might say, okay, this is too much. You cannot do this. And if it's you as an individual making that decision, I don't have a problem with it. I think my biggest problem with what this guy did, again, is that he sort of did it very unilaterally. And to me, the way he did it felt immature too. It really did.
And with authority that was only questionably his.
Right.
Yeah, and that wasn't the point of the project in the first place.
Right.
Yeah.
That it wasn't intended to be an exclusionary project. So I'm thinking of a different thing than the Dalai Lama. I'm thinking that there are people who are, building, say, for instance, systems to help support people get out the vote.
Mm-hmm.
Or, and they're very explicitly have a political leaning behind them, right? Not the system per se, the system that helps people carpool to other, places so that they can campaign.
But I'd rather get out the
people
vote for my own guy or girl.
No. Oh, your own.
Like,
not necessarily your own candidate, but the one you support.
Right.
Right? Who's not necessarily.
That's what I mean.
Yeah,
I'm building a get out the vote tool. I hope that I get out a lot of votes from my candidate and not the other candidate.
Well, or your class of candidate, right?
Sure.
You want to, we have to come up with two maybe different colors than red and blue.
I would like to get out the votes that further my political hopes, whatever they
Yes,
may
exactly.
be. Yeah.
Exactly. And you and the people who have been working with you on building this get out the vote tool, they're all in the same, polka dot party or leanings and not in the stripe leanings. And there ought to be a way, probably, to license that. And so probably it's not an open source sort of thing in that point to say this is a tool that we have built and we want to have used by people who we're substantially in agreement with.
Right.
Yeah, I think to me, that's a case of something that even if I strongly disagreed with whoever was using the tool, I don't think that's where I would make my stand. Like, I think that is almost being somewhat petty about it. We're not talking about people's lives necessarily being in danger, et cetera, et cetera.
Wait. So if you build this tool, you put a lot of your blood, sweat, and tears into building this tool.
Yep.
Explicitly for a particular, political viewpoint.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that that it's perfectly okay for people to pick up that tool and run with it and forward in benefiting, for some other political viewpoint?
If that's what the license says they can do, yeah. I mean, and I would not restrict the licensing on that type of thing either. I wouldn't say you have to be X, Y, or Z to use this thing.
You would build that thing with an open source license. An unrestricted open source license.
Honestly, I probably wouldn't build it to begin with because I just can't stand politics in general. Uh-huh. But if I did build it, yeah, it would be an open source license, and the views of the average person changes over time. And the overall views of society change over time. I'm not going to make a decision that you must agree with me if you're going to use this tool. I think that's bordering on, I think it's a little bit petty, and I think it's bordering on being narcissistic about it.
The example that Marion gives is a little bit, because Marion, in your example, you're talking about someone who set out to build this thing, right? Like if they're, right. I feel like that's a little bit different than like the software that's a little more general purpose, because when you're building a tool like that, a political tool, it's a very specific use case. And right. So unless the developers were completely naive, they would have to know that if they open source that,
Right.
it would likely be used by anyone to get the vote out. But it's within their purview to write a license that would prevent, like you said, we're the polka dot party. If you're in the Stripes party, you can't use this. Like, they could license it that way if they wanted to.
If they wanted to.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
But that's a difference
Or they
between
could not license it at all.
right, or
which is-
right, yeah.
Yeah, or just keep it
More
closed source.
Right, yeah, build your own website and then
Yeah.
just run the site. Right, yeah.
Yeah.
So I
But
don't
you
know
know-
if that's,
Well, that begs the question, if I may, Michael, like, are there any, can you think of people who might come to you to build a website that you'd say no? You don't have to name who they are, but like, can you think of
Sure.
individuals or groups that you just be like, nah, not going to do that, bro.
There have been many.
Right. And I've done the same. So, but what about if it came out, like, I'm going to reverse the question you gave me. What is your threshold for someone who is using your Wordsmith plugin? What is your threshold for denying them support or, firing them as a client?
Right. Well, my threshold for denying them support is Wordsmith is free, and you don't get any support.
Okay. I knew you were going to get pedantic
come on,
about
man.
it.
No,
For
I get
a
it.
paid plugin that you
Yeah.
provide support for in exchange for money.
Yeah, I get it. Man,
This is an argument against having paid plugins right there. I mean, I don't have paid plugins, and that's one of the reasons why.
Right.
Is that
yeah.
I think I would be
You don't, I mean, to some extent,
on
like,
who I wanted to support.
yeah, if you're building a website, you can very easily pick and choose your client, right? Because there are these big chunks of things that you work on. If you build a plugin,
not only can you, but really, that's a moral obligation. Is that
Yeah.
you ought to
sure.
be picky
If
and
you-
not, and
Yeah.
If you have a cause that you care about, then sure, you can skew that way. If you have something you super disagree with, sure, you can refuse that work. But the point that I was trying to lead to is that a plugin is more like a mass market store where, if you walk into Walmart, like, Walmart doesn't care what your political affiliations are. They don't care about any of that kind of stuff. You're just going there to buy this, like, productized thing, right?
it's like who'd be willing to bake cakes for, and it had better be everybody.
Right. And then the other
I'm
part
not
of
the opinion that you have to bake cakes for everybody. In fact, I think that's a really dangerous expectation.
right.
Is that commerce has to be compelled by fiat.
Right. The same way that you might
oppose people's individuals' convictions.
the same way that you might refuse to build a website for somebody, maybe somebody else who builds cakes might refuse to build a cake for somebody or whatever. But I guess the point that I'm trying to make is that, Walmart isn't going to be, they're not going to vet you for your political, social views before they'll let you in the store to buy something. And then also, if you're buying something and you use it for not its intended purpose to then bash someone's skull in, I don't think they're responsible either.
Yeah. To answer your specific question, I think my line morally, I don't know that I would ever get to my line morally because I am protected in that the license requires you to use my software for purposes that are not illegal.
Right.
And
Well, ICE is legal.
Rare case.
ICE is legal.
It's a very rare case that I personally would be convicted enough about something that is legal
Right.
that I would take enough moral issue with it
Right.
that I would try to subvert your rights as a purchaser of my open source software.
Oh, man, I'm so much looser with my stuff than you guys.
I may, and there have been a few times for various reasons where I have said, I'm sorry, I'm not able to provide the support that you're asking for. Here's a refund.
Right.
Go on your happy way.
Right.
And sometimes those have been because a client was disrespectful to me.
Right.
Sometimes they've been because I just felt an icky gut feeling about something that was going down,
Right.
Or I suspected that there was something illegal or nefarious going on. And even if I don't have grounds to make an assertion of that, or if I don't feel like it's my moral prerogative to sort of impose ethics on you, I can still say, I'm going to peace out.
Right.
And I can still sort of go through other channels if I feel a need to be ethically active in that situation, besides raising some legal issue about the license of my software. So like specifically, I don't know that I'd ever get so far as to try to like revoke someone's license to a thing that, a plugin that they bought. I think I would probably just excuse myself from interacting with that client and try to go through some other channel. But,
so you'd give them their money back and say, I'm not going to help you with your problems here.
Right.
But that's different from saying, and you can't use it.
Right. Yeah. And I agree with Andrew. Like, I do have a professional responsibility to support a purchaser of my plugin if I have said that I will.
Right.
But sometimes, I think it's okay for me to relieve myself of that professional obligation, by sort of reverting the money changing hands that, would motivate me having a commercial responsibility to someone. I think there's one thing though that I want to sort of spin this whole conversation so that we can start to wrap it up, which is that we've been talking a lot about the negative case and, what our responsibility is to prevent our stuff, our tech that we build from being used in ways that we don't agree with. How do y'all feel about a responsibility specifically to support and encourage and facilitate our technologies being used for stuff that we do think serves the common good and serves, ethical considerations?
So I'm going to go first because it's going to be really quick and it's going to be totally different from Earl. I am incredibly anti-activist, right? And not to say that I don't have views or whatever, but I don't feel that my business or my professional work is the way to further them. So no, I just don't go down that route in terms of going out of my way to promote political in either sense of the term, or ethical or moral causes that I happen to personally agree with, because I am very cognizant that there are many perfectly good people that may disagree with me and may have other views on certain things. And I don't think it's my place to impose my view of the world on them via the lens of the professional work that I do. So my answer is not at all. Totally different from Earl. Go ahead, Earl.
Yes, I put politics and civic life above business concerns. So, yeah, any means necessary to do what you think is right, including, just to speak quickly to what you guys were talking about as far as supporting stuff. I would go even further than ROG, which would be, instead of just dismissing them and offering them a refund, I would actively sabotage them.
Oh, dear God.
I think that there is maybe a small percentage of like my anarcho-punker friends who are listening to this that might be thinking that's what I would do too. So you're not alone. You do whatever you think is right.
I think that, platitude, but in general, we all have sort of a moral responsibility to try and make the world a better place, or at the very least, not a worse place.
Right.
And that one of the ways that, us tech people tend to have more leverage in doing that is by doing the tech stuff. But on the other hand, it can be really important to have some balance in your life and to, have spaces in your life where you are doing something other than the tech stuff. And
Yeah.
Obviously, that's not going to be so much in your profession. So maybe in your
Well,
explicitly doing things for trying to make the world a better place, explicitly civic engagement things, maybe you want to be doing them. Maybe you just can't be spending your spare energy building websites for good causes because you are just done with building websites.
Okay, so I guess what I mentioned might be mischaracterized. I don't have any problem with if I or someone else wanted to volunteer my time to do work for a cause that I believed in. I think that's great. But what I mean is, like, I would never in a million years on my corporate website endorse like a political candidate, right? Because I just don't think there's the place for that. If you want to use, I think there was a speaker at .all who talked about using your superpowers for good. If you want to use your technical abilities to further whatever cause you find valuable, absolutely. Like, I think that's great. But I feel very strongly about not getting a corporate involved in the dog and pony show part of politics, and
How about
making
Twitter,
it
then?
even on Twitter, like a corporate. I think a corporate Twitter account, I don't think should be involved in any of that. If a person on their personal Twitter wants to, go for it.
So do you have 2 Twitters then?
I do.
You do? Okay. So that's the way to handle it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I struggle with this because, like, I think one of the real curses of entrepreneurship is that it becomes very difficult to tease apart the person and the professional. And I don't know, just the way my life experience has tilted, I frequently feel that how I behave as a professional is like how I express my morality as a person, and so it's not easy for me to say, like Earl did, it's not easy for me to say my personal morals are more important than my professional morals because they're the same for me. And so I don't know exactly how to navigate that, except to say that I don't see them as separate. And so in as much as I feel morally compelled to be active in some way, I will probably be active in that way both as a professional and in other contexts. And I will probably be more subtle and differently expressed with my professional colleagues than with other peers. But like, it's probably going to come out in both professional and non-professional contexts because it's just me.
Right. Well, there's the I guess the part of it that I have a big problem is the politicalization of things, right? So if I go to Starbucks and there's a huge sign endorsing a particular candidate that I find detestable, that's going to bother me, and that's going to color my thinking of Starbucks, right?
And it should.
Yeah,
and that's why it's a free market.
And that's why it's a free market. But what I'm saying is that's why I think it's a poor decision to do that. Like, why would you, as a business, intentionally alienate a huge number or a large percentage of your potential customers? There's just no need for that in a business. Go ahead.
Penzi's Spices is doing actually fairly well.
I don't know what that is.
Yeah, they involved in a
Penzi's Spices,
turmoil.
their spice company, absolutely. They
I love Penzi's Spices. What did they do?
What did they do? They have made strong political statements.
Right. I'm just saying that I personally, when I see businesses doing that, it annoys me. Even if the person that they are touting is someone that I agree with. Like, it's just one of those things that I just don't think that that's where I want to have that discussion, right? I mean, we're assaulted by this stuff nearly nonstop. I don't want to deal with it when I'm going in to get a Starbucks. I don't want everything to be politicized. I think it gets really tiresome, and I think it causes fatigue, and it annoys people, and it causes people to tune you out. I think that to some extent it may have the opposite effect that you're intending.
Yeah, and I've heard that argument before, and that's a super privileged stance to take, because those things that are annoying you while you're trying to get coffee are affecting people in real ways. Like when they support someone who, I used the example before about taking healthcare away from people or something like that. while it's an annoyance to you to have to hear about those things, people are affected in very material ways by those things that they're
like the evil that is Nestle.
Well, yeah, I mean, there's lots and lots of examples, but I don't care if it annoys you or not, because it's much more serious than that for other people.
I think people are really bad at quantifying the consequences of things upon people other than themselves.
That's true.
And as such, I think we are generally bad at ascribing urgency to things that are very morally important, or I should say ethically important, but that don't directly harm or inconvenience us.
Right. Yeah. I guess the real problem that I have with it, Earl, is that what you think is right is not necessarily what other people think is right. And while it may be, super important to you and you think that this is, an absolute priority, there are lots of people that don't agree with that. I mean, just in the same way, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. That's what Rog is saying.
It's because it doesn't affect you personally. Like, just because ICE doesn't affect you personally, you have the privilege of not having a strong opinion about it. But other people aren't in that position. Or they are, but they choose to involve themselves beyond that.
Right. And what I'm trying to say is that there may be, people who believe something very, very antithetical to what you believe, and they may have views that you find detestable. And if you saw those plastered on a store, you would have a very negative opinion on that. And as a business, why would you want to ostracize a certain percentage of your customers?
We did talk briefly
before. And the reason
before.
is because it's the right thing to do.
Well, right. That's what we talked a little bit about that before the show
started. And where is your
line? With B Corp stuff, is they're saying our business isn't strictly about building the biggest customer base. It's about being a business and also promoting our political agenda,
right?
I guess, or not necessarily even the political agenda. In the B Corp sense, it's things like environmentalism and business transparency and things like that. So the reason that people do that is because the baseline that they're shooting for isn't the same as, like, again, and that's what I meant by my personal stuff takes precedence over personal. It's not to say that there's two separate me's, like there's professional Earl who wears a tie. You obviously know it's not true.
No, I can verify that is not true.
It's to say that business isn't important to me.
Yeah.
It's what I do to make sure I can do the other stuff.
Sure. Absolutely. You don't live to work, you work to live. Yeah, I totally get that. And I agree with that. But, so for instance, I also have equally the same problem of businesses that try to inject their religion into what they do. Mm-hmm. Right? I don't think that that's the place for it. Do you think it's the place for something like that? If people have a super strong belief in a particular religion, do you think that it's their place to do that, injecting that into their business? I view the political and religious things as both things that just should not be injected into a business for the same reason.
Yeah, that's a reasonable question.
I think they're fine to inject into businesses, and then it's incumbent on us to notice and vote with our feet.
Well, I want to hear what Earl's opinion on that, because I see no difference between a business trying to promote their political agenda and a business trying to promote their religious agenda. I see both of those things as being very out of place for them to be doing, and they may have very, very strong opinions and beliefs about both of those things.
Right. Well, I'm not a spiritual person. I'm an atheist. It doesn't matter. I'll just say it. Who cares? But religion is also politics. Depending on your point of view, I suppose. Like, there's no empirical evidence for a God, so I have no reason to think that it is. So to me, it's another aspect of politics.
So that's fine, but there are lots of people that would disagree with you, right?
Right.
And what if there was a business that you frequented it and you loved it, mm-hmm. and then you walk in there one day and it's plastered with all sorts of religious messages, and when you walk in there, they tell you, well, to honor our particular deity, you have to kneel here and you have to put this on before you go in the store. Like, how would you feel about that?
Well, right. I mean, if it bothered me that much, I would stop going there.
But as a business owner, like you've got to understand that would alienate a huge number of people, And maybe you just wouldn't do it.
Yeah, but look at the success of the Republican Party. I mean, all their Christian buffoonery. It boosts their numbers amongst a certain group of people and isolates
But why do that? But why do that? Like, why not just
because you don't need everybody.
It's an expression of what you believe to be true, and the closer you think you are to truth, the more urgency you ought to have about it. Right?
Yeah.
Like if I believe something, to actually truly believe a thing means that I am orienting my behavior towards the truthfulness of that thing. And so, like, if you think that it is absolutely necessary that everyone that comes into your store kneels in a certain place, like if that is your truth, then as a business owner, yeah, I guess you ask your customers to do that, and you take whatever hit in customer base that's going to produce because you believe that to be true. And it's on a scale, right? Like my car wash has a little bulletin board that when you go in to pay your ticket, it says, "Would you like us to pray for you?" Pin a little note up on this bulletin board. And it's very subtle, and I think it's very sweet, and I don't mind it at all. And I don't think that a person of any faith walking past that bulletin board ought to be very offended about it.
Right.
But it certainly stops short of the point on that spectrum where you are, asserting not just what your beliefs are, but what someone else's behavior ought to be. And so, I think it's definitely a big scale of gray. And I think that if we've learned anything from this whole conversation, it's okay. So you have both a prerogative and a responsibility to act in ways that you feel are morally necessary and ethically reasonable. But all of this stuff takes a lot of stop and think.
Yeah.
And you got to make sure that you're educated deeply enough and convicted enough to take whatever consequences are going to come from your decisions.
Yeah.
And you've got to make sure that whatever power or authority you think you're acting on does actually belong to you.
Yeah. So we solved it.
So in summary,
we solved ethics.
Be careful how you license your open source software. And
Think
for
about
the devMode podcast, I'm Michael Rogg.
I'm Andrew Welch.
I'm Earl Johnston.
I'm Mary Milovich.
Oh, I can't wait to hear what comments y'all are going to leave on our website, devMode.fm.
God.
Please come join this conversation. We'll post a bunch of episode links. You can follow us on the Twitters, on the iTunes, pretty much everywhere that has a devMode.fm handle. And please, if you're listening on iTunes, do give us a review. It helps other people find the show.
I'm going to put Michael's email up there. You can direct all comments to Michael. Bye-bye.
We'll see y'all next time.